Hello, everybody. Welcome to the last session of the Open Lab Seminar of the CUDAN Open Lab here in Tallinn. And today it's our greatest pleasure to have Isabel Meirelles in a live connection from Toronto, Canada. And so basically, I will not give a large introduction. Isabel and I met 13 years ago, I guess, at Barabasi Lab at Northeastern University, which was a much less known place than it is right now. And we have done awesome things in between. And Isabel has written, among other things, one fantastic book about design for information, and has organized in recent years conferences to bring together data visualization people, and has been an advocate for not only the cutting edge of data visualization, but also do this with a historical perspective, which I think is something we all sort of like constantly learn from, because we can do better if we have that kind of perspective. And so I would just give the stage to you. You can share your screen, and I'll let 7 more people in, which are in the waiting room.
Perfect. So thank you. Thank you, Max. I'm going to put my presentation here in slideshow presentation, and then I'll share it and go back there, and then share the screen and share here. And share. Okay. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I would like to start by acknowledging the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the original owners and custodians of the land on which I work and live, and also where OCAD University, where I teach, is located. So, okay, I need to go here and let me get my turn the pointer. And so thank you so much, Max, for the kind introduction. Let me bring, I put you on the other screen, but it's always kind of tricky. So I'll keep moving you. So I'm moving my head in my 2 screens. And thank you so much for the kind invitation. It's such a pleasure to be in conversation again and with your team over there. I hope to visit you one day over there. So and seeing familiar faces like Mila. Thank you so much, and for being there. And this is going to be a conversation. I really want this to be informal. And there was a lot of, I kept changing as time went by, given the need to change. And I really would love to have a conversation about certain issues that I'm going to bring here. And so I'm going to ask for your participation. Please, feel comfortable to participate. It's not a classroom, right? No one is being requested to participate, but I think there are some things that we need to talk and discuss why we're doing certain things and not others, and perhaps argue for argumentation. What my point here perhaps is to argue for visual argumentation, not only descriptive argumentation. And so basically, and that's how I start. So it's divided in different sessions. The first is actually something about descriptive and argumentative spectrum. I wrote this a while back. Some of you have heard me speaking in different ways about this, but it was really in this book that I wrote in 2015, but it eventually was a chapter that was published eventually only in 2018. And I'll be in conversation with a few books, not as many as I'd like, because I wanted to keep it simple for our conversation. And so, and my question is, why don't we see more visual arguments? And we tend to see descriptive visualizations on papers, on chapters, on talks, when I think they belong more to an exploratory understanding of our topics. And so this is actually a photograph of one of the pages of the book, in which I actually read, and I'm going to read it here, descriptive representations are essential to the research process due to being fertile platforms for interpretation and insight, which will ultimately lead to argumentative representations and generation of new knowledge. And then I go into explaining and say, one of the dangers of descriptive visualization is that they offer opportunities for new perceptions about the content under scrutiny. Care should be taken so as not to consider them as definite proofs or deterministic models. And that's the point here, that eventually what happens is, if we keep only using descriptive visualizations, we are kind of presenting things as they are definite, when we know they are not. When we know they are unstable, they are one perspective or one rendition or of an algorithm or of a node link, for example, for, and so on and so forth. So that is the point here for this first part of the conversation. In the book, I mentioned as one of the examples, and I brought here some familiar examples for the conversation. I mentioned A.B. Warburg's Mnemosyne Atlas, and I'm not going to dwell on this example. I'm going to dwell on something that is perhaps more familiar, including to Max and I, that actually dwell on this particular model here and diagram when we created our own symposium on arts, humanities, and complex networks that was parallel to NetSci for a number of years. And there was a reason why we actually chose this particular diagram. And so I don't think there is any question about considering this visualization by Barr that is actually on the cover of a book. I have a copy, I just couldn't find it. I believe it is in my office. But as a argumentative visualization. And so there is a whole family of those visualizations. There is this beautiful book and exhibition recently. I don't know if you were able to go there or if you have these, but it's actually an incredible discussion, including beautiful chapter by Astrid Schmidt-Burkhardt on all these and on the family of all this, which is pretty much part of what I believe Max coming from, right? Given that you have studied art history and I haven't. And so what I want us to look at these and think, why do we think these arguments? And so what is it that makes this an argument and not a description? Or maybe you disagree with me, maybe you think it is descriptive. It's, of course, it's like, as I put it there, it's not a dichotomy, it's actually a spectrum. And so, of course, there are parts of every single image that we're going to talk here that are descriptive and eventually argumentative. Many of them are not. But any thoughts about that? Or is it too early for asking your contributions?
No, I think not at all. So maybe that is a question we should pose to the audience. I like this format a lot, A, and B, I did come from that tradition, and like my whole PhD is about visual representation and how it is successful and fails to convey truth or some reality. And there is no way, I would argue there is no visualization that is purely descriptive. There's always some iconography going on, even if you go to, say, physical review letters, black and white scatter plots from the 1980s that don't look very much like a data visualization, but they are, of course, and they nevertheless are subject to convention and to hide certain things and show certain things. But so this is an interesting question. So this thing here in particular is a really neat subject of discussion, because it is at the same time was so necessary, and at the same time it was so wrong, which is also quite interesting. Mila has raised her hand.
Yes, Mila, please.
I don't have any good answers. I can only kind of think out loud here, because I started to think that actually always when you put something on a paper, try to somehow describe what you think, or what is the data or anything. There is always, of course, a kind of like selection. What do you prefer to present, in what order, what is the perspective? So I was trying to think about contra arguments for myself, but so far I didn't find any. But I'm trying during this talk. So yeah.
And I absolutely think you're hit on, right? I mean, both, there is no right and wrong answer, right? Pretty much, just to start with, right? So I don't think, you know, I think Max is absolutely right that there is no neutrality. Every single mark brings a decision about why we're making a visual mark wherever we are making them. And so there is no neutral, right, in the sense that Max was talking, and I'm going to bring that later. And I think, yeah, there's this beautiful, you know, we are really not talking here about images of thinking, right, of how even people have used throughout times, including Bar, you know, spatializing or visualizing our thoughts, and actually with words, whether those are words, whether those are symbols, or, and so I think you're also completely hit on that, Mila, in that eventually there are very specific reasons why Bar, I would imagine, have decided that some lines have different qualities, right? And we're going to see this in other very well-known examples that I'm going to show here, you know, why they are red or black, why they are, you know, dotted or solid, why they're kind of holding things together like two hands, and so on and so forth. There is reason for actually putting things on chronologically, right, as we see it there, and so on and so forth. So all these are intentions that eventually for him to set forth his argument, that actually it's interesting that it became the cover of the book, right, rather than other parts of it. So if we
can I comment something?
Please, yeah.
I think there's two things to say, which is like this timidness that we get with images, like Mila says, like you put something on paper, but then it doesn't show everything. It's interesting that this comes up with images much more than with text, even though texts are even worse, right? Like as Umberto Eco says, the text is a lazy machine where the mind has to fill in the gaps. And so obviously it's so blatantly obvious that like most of the stuff has to come out of your brain. And it's the geometric congruence that images give you where all of a sudden it becomes uncanny, right? Because there is so much similarity to reality then that we feel bad about not putting certain things in. And so what I meant before with this image, I think, why was it necessary? Why is it at the same time so wrong? So it has been discussed as so wrong, right? And yes, it is. Like Negro sculpture and Japanese prints should not be in the same category as machine aesthetic. I mean, they're humans. There is like African-American humans, and there is Japanese humans doing art, and why should they be different from whatever's going on in the background? This obviously has something to do with the collection, which is specific. It's a particular bunch of families, including Rockefeller, doing this kind of thing. But then there is this other thing, why was it necessary, which is typically not discussed. This happens at the very same time as the Degenerate art exhibition in the Haus der Kunst in Munich, where Hitler puts together very similar artworks, basically saying, look at this stuff, this is all degenerate. And the poster for that is also black, orange, and white. Shows a mask, an expressionist kind of mask-like sculpture, if I remember well, and then just says degenerate art. And that is sort of something which I think needs to be seen at the same time. So what this picture now is criticized for is exactly the opposite of the impression it would have made to somebody who just emigrated from Munich, just made it out, and then sees this thing and sort of sees it validated. And that is, I think, is a very important point. Like even the things, you know, like this also emphasizes African sculpture as something that has a valid role within art, even though it's in a world that is, you know, chauvinist male, looking down at people. That is, of course, right?
Yeah.
But
I think that is the point that eventually we could discuss. And I want to remove the discussion from right and wrong, really. I don't think it is appropriate, at least to my talk, right? I think even if people argued in the past or even created science in the past that eventually later was shown to be not correct hypotheses, right? It's really not about that, right? So I think what I'm trying to say here is that it is okay to commit to paper, even if a year later the same author might actually come and say, hey, you know, that actually argument was not, my thinking was not that what it was, right? And so so there's the whole ethical part that you were mentioning here that I think are still valid, and we should actually go back and revisit these in the light of some discrimination, including terms that were used rather than other terms. So I think that part is a discussion that eventually I'm not even perhaps well equipped, given that I am not an art historian, right? So I would like to discuss them in the view, yes, in terms of setting forth some visual arguments that eventually carry over through many years, that eventually might have misled people. I agree with you on that, Max, in terms of actually perpetuating some thinking and avoiding others to actually occupy space because of being such a strong personality there. But I think what I'm trying to say is that it is important that we commit to paper and that we make mistakes, so to speak, right? Because like words, we can actually revisit things, and we should be revisiting. And so when we fear actually making selective thoughts or making more grandiose diagrams, that I think, you know, there is a history, and that's why I pointed to that genealogies of art book that is a beautiful history of how people actually made that throughout time. And that's not the topic of this, but I agree with you. What I want to actually contrast is from that image that is very much what I believe a visual is a description, but it's a description from a very particular perspective. It was Alfred Barr's perspective, the narrative he wanted to set forth in the word for particular reasons that actually Max even pointed out in terms of the collection that he made and so on and so forth. With this one that coincidentally it was, I was even mentioning to Max earlier, that actually in a beautiful conversation that Max had recently at the ZKM for occasion of the exhibition of Barbasi's work at the ZKM. And so in my view, this actually is a descriptive image. This is an image that is, even though, you know, this is the website, but eventually they also made a poster. You can all download it there. And so here it's easier to look at the key here. So the orange artists are those who have over 24 connections within this network. And again, it also is closely connected to, in part, not only to the MoMA collection. So we're still within the MoMA collection and perspectives and so on, even though here there is a little bit more opening there. But in my view, this is much more of a descriptive image towards the spectrum, right? It falls much more towards the descriptive image than into the argument there. So if we, and I don't know if you would agree with that, right? But the intentionalities, whether they were right or wrong, and so that's why I wanted to remove the argument from there, Max. So not to stop the conversation, we can come back to them. I think they're very they're very important. But it's really about the visual representation here that I would like to keep the conversation perhaps, and why perhaps I feel that way. I don't know if everyone would feel that way. Why one, feels, even though it's descriptive, it actually is much more about a narrative that one particular person, in this case Alfred Barr, wanted to create and to install into people's minds, art historians, collectors, artists, and so on and so forth. And the other is actually a description based on a certain category or criteria, I should say, that is the connectiveness of in a period of time, right? And so I don't know if anyone has any thoughts in this regard. So I'll move on and we'll come back. Max is kind of, I know it's kind of an interesting topic, and that's why I called it a conversation. So and I think one of the things that I want to say is that, eventually when we create arguments, which goes back to what Mila mentioned, which is actually making selections, editing out things, and deciding what to include or not include. And I don't know if you're thinking about that, Mila, when I mentioned that. And I'll come to you, Mike, in a second. Let me just finish this train of thought here. But when we make those selections, when we edit out, when we compromise, when there are dangers of actually losing the directionality that we want our readers to read. And that's what was the segue to the next one. But I'll stop that train of thought and come to Mike, please.
Okay, well, basically, the question which comes to my mind looking at the picture on the right is how exactly the position of the nose was decided by the person who created this illustration, because I mean, it's heavily, this picture heavily implies the existence of at least 4 clusters in this system. Yes, one on the right, one on the top, one on the left, and a big one in the middle. And it is not exactly clear that this existence of these clusters is supported, for example, by the degree of nodes. For example, Larionov and Goncharova are very heavily connected with the central part, and it is not clear if they indeed more connected with the right-hand side as with the central part. So there is some interpretation already in this image.
Yeah, I think it was algorithmically. Thank you, Mike, for the intervention there. And I think, in part, that is the difference that actually makes it into, one being an argument and the other being a more of a descriptive, right? Because it's given by whatever spatial criteria that was decided, given the algorithm. And it could have been different. As we keep, rendering, there is the forces that actually keep things moving. Maybe they moved certain nodes outside so that there would be, and I believe that it was actually, I don't know. We actually tried to bring them, remember, Max? We tried to bring to the symposium, but we were unable to do that. But if we read here, he says this diagram maps the nexus of relationships among those artists represented in the exhibition, Inventing Abstraction, 1910-2025, all of whom played significant roles in the development of the modern language for the arts. Vectors connect individuals whose acquaintance with one another during these years could be documented. And the artists in orange are artists who have over 24 connections within the network, and the other ones are who have fewer than 24 connections. And so there was a conversation, even so slightly, during the ZKM talk, that eventually I believe the teams of the lab would have chatted there. So, but I agree. I think that, we could question, and it's important to actually question why, we see the clusters and we could discuss the cluster algorithm used here, or whether it was actually, if people actually decided for those. I actually don't know. I don't know the answer, but I think I think it's important. I would say that if they did that, it's not as clear, but I don't know. Max, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I don't know. So if you go to the comparison, I think the two images, and I think this is something we should emphasize. The right one is influenced by two things, like the shape of the labels and the color and everything. Obviously, the background is influenced by the bar diagram. The actual color in the background makes you also think of Edward Tufte. And the third thing it is influenced by is obviously network visualization. What's very important of like the first 10 years of this century. What is very important to mention is, I think, that it's a collaboration where somebody was an expert on the letters, somebody was an expert on drawing networks, and then there was even a graphics team, if I remember well, that sort of like went over this again. While on the left, it's very clearly the product of one individual, where we have the pencil sketches and stuff like that, who tended to think that way. Like Bar did drawings all the time, and he's not the first one. There's people like Guy Muller and whatever in the 19th century did these kind of things. They thought diagrammatically about history, how it folds out. And one thing that is important is how much about this picture is new and novel. There is a layout algorithm, which looks like a bull. There is a timeline. This is 20 years, 30 years happening before Eugene Garfield came up with this principle called a historiograph. So you can see that the vertical order makes some sense. There is not nodes and links. There is all sorts of stuff. There is node-like things. There is things that are, I don't know what's cubism in this particular case. It says cubism, and then there is even a label of the label, a date range, and then there's this huge arch which bundles certain things. And so it's almost like, this looks like like troop movements on a military map. And so all these things play a role. The lines are not just straight lines; they have curvature. They are dotted lines. They avoid certain things while they go through other things. And so this is thought processes which I think individuals who do visualizations from scratch, from having the domain expertise, grappling with the data, choosing a mode of representation, they will all go through the same process as Bar, even if they collaborate, I think.
And I think that's exactly my point. Thank you, Max. That eventually, for me, the image on the right is actually something that is part of the exploration process. It's actually a descriptive image that for a general public that is a museum goer of the MoMA would actually, it is, I wouldn't know if I had a fresh eyes and I came across that image where I would start reading it. Or as Mike points out, why are certain people scattered or nearby, and so on and so forth. So many questions would have come to mind because there is no clear directionality. There is, for different reasons, right? So we cannot always argue that eventually network visualizations have that by nature, right? Have that by nature because of the relationships and not the hierarchies and so on and so forth, right? Whereas in the bar diagram, there is sort of a sense of causality, right? Given the directionality, there is a sense of evolution given the years. So there are different things that people might actually even assume when they are actually perhaps not even there. But that image is actually for me an image that could have, and I would argue, would have been stronger had people worked further into compromises, into actually more intentional message being conveyed here as an argument and not as a description. What does a lay person coming to the MoMA would have learned, and that would be interesting to us from actually encountering this image. right? And so, and I think in part, and we can argue that, right? In part, I think it is, and that is the only part that I'm going to mention some cognitive things here, is actually that vision is task-oriented, right? And what we see when confronted with a scene depends as much as on our goals and expectations as it does on the array of light that enters our eyes. And that's why it can be very, very powerful. And when we, and sometimes when it is deceptive or ethically wrong and so on and so forth, it actually can be very damaging, right? So we actually have to be very careful with what we do, the same way that we are with words. And so I'm going to show next. I don't know how many of you have seen these, but if you remember when we were kids that we have two images, like this one has a ring and this one doesn't. So you had to find the difference in the two hands, for example. Remember those 7 mistakes or 10 mistakes or something like that? Do you remember? Did you all did that? So
Yes.
I'm going to show a movie, and I don't know if you all have seen this before. So if you have seen, I would say, don't say anything, but I'm going to just play it for a very short time. And the image is actually one after the other. So you're going to see an image that actually is a sequence, is a little short movie, that there is a gray screen between those two images. So you never see them side to side, but it's one after the other. And I would like to invite you to look for what is different between these two images. And then I'll ask you to someone who has been able to see it to actually tell what it is. I would like to say it's very hard. It is really extremely hard. So don't get frustrated. Don't get disappointed with yourself if you don't see it, because it's really very hard. So ready? Okay. So let me just here, just put it in a loop and let's try this. Has anyone seen the difference?
Yep.
Yeah. Do you want to say, I don't know how to pronounce your name, Veyun?
Yeah, Veyun, the color of a person's pants on the left.
Yeah, that's it. So it's really hard, right? And maybe people here have not seen it. We are very close to it, so it makes it easier to see. When we see it from further away, it's much harder, but some people might not have seen it. So had I actually asked you, hey, can you find the difference in the color of something, that would have helped perhaps people to see this, right? And but not pointing. And I saw some people's eyes moving, kind of scanning the image. We go and we scan and we keep looking from, what is going on, right? So let's try another one here. Let me put the loop here. I see a smile there, Veyun. And that was much easier, right? Do you want to say it, Veyun? You're muted.
The bush in between the trees.
The bush. And actually, believe it or not, right? When we actually see it, it's right in the center. And some people, and still it's like some people are unable to see it, because pretty much that is exactly the same thing as here, right? It's like that is the fun of finding Waldo or finding Wally, whatever you call it, right? Because there are so many distractors there that eventually, if we don't point to where, and don't ask me because I don't know where he is in this image, I would have to spend hours looking. That's why you give it to kids to keep quiet, right? Say, look for Wally, right? Or whatever, right? And so pretty much because we're not pointing it, right? So that is the value of actually calling attention to or making annotations or things like that. And so going back to that process of actually making intentionally pointing to where we want people to look at our representations as we move away from, as we learn from our descriptive images into what we want them to take away, right? And that's, I want to continue the conversation. So I want to talk now about a conversation about abstraction and visual rhetorics, and how I believe that as we discussed right now, right, if we go back into Barr's diagram or that network visualization of artists at MoMA, they all use abstract elements of circles or lines and qualities of things and words. And so, and how I would like to argue here that it's not because they use abstract elements to represent information that they are neutral, right? And we discussed how not neutral, you know, Barr's diagram is. And so, and this time I'm in conversation with the beautiful book Network Turn by Ruth, Sebastian, Nicole, and Scott, that came out last December, actually. And I, you know, I got that idea, even though I could have gotten elsewhere, in terms of how, you know, the artists, the scientists use connectivity to make sense of data and a representation of knowledge that relies on abstraction. And I think a lot of representations that we see, our visualizations, rely on abstraction into sense, and we're going to look at it in a minute. And so, and if we look at what abstraction is, and so I'm going to, there are two sides to abstraction. Of course, you know, there is, you know, abstraction in the sense of actually working with concepts so that we can talk about, you know, from concrete, you know, going to philosophy, even in terms of how concrete objects or abstract objects in terms of philosophical thinking and how we work with theories and concepts. And also the other aspect here, which is the representational aspect. So we can actually deal with them separately because not necessarily they are together. And that's eventually what we saw in the descriptive visualization, for example, right? They might make use of abstract elements to describe things that are not necessarily conceptual. And like this line bar here, it is an abstract representation. It's using a line, but not representing something conceptual. It's actually descriptive of the usage of the word as seen at the Oxford English Dictionary. So now we come to another well-known visualization to all of us, that is not the one that actually they start their book, the Network Turn, but actually it's the one that I use in my own book when I start the chapter on network, on related visualizations, relational visualizations. So here I believe we are all very familiar with Mark Lombardi, and again, you know, there's I don't know where my book here is. Oh, here. I was actually first encountered it in the first retrospective where I actually bought this at New York in 2003. And I was amazed by those huge drawings on the walls. I don't know if any one of you have actually seen them close together. But here we have, you know, not differently from what we saw in those two visualizations that we looked before, both the bar diagram and the network visualization done in collaboration with the group at Columbia University and MoMA. But we have one of many of Lombardi's visualizations, and I believe they are intentions and decisions that were made here. And I would say that this is more towards the argument. So there are decisions why, in my view, at least, Lombardi decided to create this particular structure rather than others. And so I would like to argue, and it's not the point here because I really want to dwell on the visual, but for me, the fact that actually he puts it all around the circle, as if we're looking at a universe, as if we're looking at the globe, pretty much, right? There is an intention there. It could have been other structures with the same connections. Of course, we know that there are, different lines. Sorry, it's like it's not a very high quality image, but they are, similar to what we discussed previously with the bar diagram. Lines have different qualities, and again, it's also constrained to red and black. We have dotted lines. We have, lines that actually have different symbology in terms of sales, in terms of, I don't even remember now, in terms of, relationships between these different entities, peoples and entities, and so on and so forth. What I here I'm bringing is that, and I'll go back to that image, is that when we are making decisions about what to represent as an argument, what to leave out of the picture, what to include in the picture, what structure is going to carry, whether the bar, which is chronological and in the tradition at historiography, like Max pointed out, and chronologies actually that are even older than those ways of looking at history of art. But it's actually, we have to let go of certain things. We cannot carry everything together, and those would be descriptive. And in the chapter there, I mentioned, pretty much this story by Borges, Funes, El Memorioso, and in which actually he describes, which is one of the fascinations of Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer, who basically, one of his fascinations is with memory, and we, in part, also because he had an incredible memory, in part also because he knew he was going to become blind, because it was a genetic disease carried in his family, and he indeed became blind, and he had to carry everything, and he wrote a lot from memory, and so because he was born with vision and lost vision, so on and so forth. But that's a different story. But here he's talking about Funes, which is this character that couldn't, everything that he saw was imprinted in that way. And so if he looked at a tree, he would actually remember every single leaf in the tree, and if in different times of the day. So every leaf was not only unique in itself, but it would be more than one, right? So there is a passage about the dog, that eventually the dog was a different dog depending if it was frontal or the side, and so on and so forth. And so what here I want to bring here is that eventually, this line here, of Borges, to think is to ignore or to forget differences, to generalize, to abstract. And in the teeming world of Irineu Funes, there was nothing but particulars, and they were virtually immediate particulars, as I described. And so what happens when, we could even go back to Bar, and maybe I should have brought that comparison back again here, is like, what is it that happens when we decide to leave things out, even if they are important, but maybe they are not important for a particular argument, for a particular way that we want to communicate our findings. And that is my invitation, and that's my provocation of the conversation here. To what extent we should be using those descriptive images in papers and in chapters, in talks, and not actually, editing out or creating and committing to the paper the same way that we do with prose. So I don't know if I see Max kind of, if you want to make any comments, I'm happy. I mean, I really mean this to be a conversation. I would
Yes,
love
yeah,
to be there in person. And that's how I took the first time I was invited. It's like, this is a conversation with a group of people. So
yes,
that's why
yes.
I'm creating those provocations here.
I'm very sorry. It's our fault. Let's make it a conversation. So I think the thing here is one can answer this in a critical way, and one can answer it in a confirmative way. Confirmatively speaking, obviously this particular picture by Lombardi leaves out lots of stuff, right? Obviously every person is reduced to either like sort of like a little word, or institutions and persons are these thoughts. Every relationship that is much more complicated is just a line. I mean, every network picture is such an abstraction, right? And at the same time, there is a layout algorithm going on, which you can at the same time give it the interpretation you just gave, where you say, this is like, it lends itself to interpretation of like looking like a universe in different depictions. If one wants to be polemic, it would say, okay, a hand-drawn network, other than like a straight ruler or sort of a compass that draws circles, there's not that many options. And it seems like he chose the compass for that, and his maximum diameter is sort of like of a certain the maximum size of this circle. So there's not infinite amount of paper he can operate on. So there's a lot of like these kind of things also that force him to sort of leave out certain things, because it's not easy to draw more complicated things. It's not easy to do something like a spring embedded layout, which yes, is the culprit of doing hairball diagrams, aka ridiculograms, but at the same time necessitates a large amount of computation to sort of balance all the.
So let's stop it here,
right?
Max. Let's stop it here. Sorry to interrupt, because you
Yeah,
said a set of things that I think are very important, and that is actually the role of the designer, and it's pretty much what I'm trying to provoke here in this conversation. Is that we need to make compromise. We need to actually make those decisions, right? In terms of the marks that we are making on the paper, to set forth or to argue with layouts, to argue with visual representations of data, right? And so the question is, to what extent we can do that, algorithmically, or to what extent we can do it. We have always to rely to go back into manual. As once we learn from the algorithms and what they bring it to us, should we then go and reinterpret them? I don't know, but I'm pretty much here. I completely agree, and that is the point, right? That actually there are many decisions that Lombardi and Barr and many others have taken in terms of deciding why this layout and not another one, right? Why, for example, in this one that is actually it's the one that actually used in the network turn, and many others, because this is, and we could even see, all these different layouts that actually were attempted, right? Why he decided for one and not the other. And unfortunately, we would not be able to ask the question, but we can only speculate, right? But the point here is the intention. The point here is actually the craft of deciding whether that layout was a particularly important for that particular story, that because he changed layouts. He doesn't use these layouts for every story, right? He actually keeps changing the layout based on different stories. And why, and I think that I think I want us to keep that, the idea is not to answer or to come to a conclusion here, right? The point is exactly that. The second point that I think I want to make is exactly the fact that the abstraction, right? And there are the two levels of abstractions that we are seeing here, that I think when we argue, right, we are arguing both theoretically, so there is that component of the abstraction. And in the case of network, and I'm using network for particular reasons here because of the interest of the group, I believe, or my relationship, kind of, our whole conversations in the past with Max, but how much actually even geometric and abstract representation is not neutral. We are not looking at a neutral visualization, right? And so I also want to decouple this actually myth that actually, because it's an abstract visualization, it's neutral and it's kind of, you know, a view from nowhere and so on and so forth. No, there is a very clear and strong arguments in those. It's not the language, the visual language necessarily just by itself that would actually impose a sense of neutrality.
So can I ask a question? So there's a, you know, people learn how to write at university, which is basically composing text. And often they're forced to hand it in Times New Roman 12 points, 1.5 line spaced with no
centralized title. Centralized title is like
exactly.
all this kind of scary kind of.
Similarly, there is, if people use Python, Jupyter notebooks or R and stuff like that, there's conventions which people think are correct, and then like that's or like, you know, that's not part of the or less part of the discussion. While what you're doing here is arguing for, one could say, not just drawing diagrams, but basically typesetting thought, which I find a very poetic and romantic way to put it, which I can very much self-identify with. But so the question is obviously, the critics may say, oh, but you know, you can't fudge with the data, right? Which they do all the time. But so how would you educate or put this in a curriculum terms, or you know, what's your argument by saying you should do that? Like, you should not just draw a scatter plot using this and that template in ggplot or whatever your, or NumPy, you know, whatever your drawing tool is, Vega Lite, or I don't know, D3. But don't just use the template, but actually engage, think about what is your line weight, what are you actually saying,
yeah,
what are the choices?
What I'm actually saying is that if I go back to the comparison here, what I'm saying is that once I draw that image on the right, that I think we should be drawing it, I think we should be rendering those things, you know, in different ways, using different criteria and trying and understanding. Once I come to an image that I understand, that I have an aha moment, or that I have some findings that I learn from it, right? How do I then communicate it to other people? Because in my view, so I'm not saying that people should stop doing that. I'm just saying that that's not the end. What I'm saying here is that that is not the end. That is the beginning, right? That's the beginning of actually your visual representation for communication. That should not be on the paper. That should not be a poster for download on at the MoMA site, right? And so, because that is not telling what they discovered. They had thoughts that they never communicated, but it's not in this image, you know? And so that is my point here. So my point is, yes, continue drawing your scatter plots, continue finding, you know, things that are important there, but then at the moment to communicate, think, you know, how you're going to communicate that finding visually, right? And so that is the point here. How to do that in curriculum, I don't know, we can discuss, right? But yeah. Sorry, those images are large images. And so the other point that eventually people make is like, should it always be kind of hand-drawn? It's like there are software out there that even kind of like, I love these, you know, by Jason Dykes and colleagues in London that actually, you know, kind of created this processing software-based software that everything that you do can be transformed into hand-drawn, right? But they are all automatically. I don't. My point here is that, it's not only the hand-drawn aspect that makes those into arguments, because we can also do that automatically, right? We can also generate this idea that it is hand-drawn, and it's actually quite effective. You know, there is a beautiful paper and that you can, I'm happy to share these slides, Max, if you want. You know, like I'm into sharing things so that you can have the links that are there. It's not a problem. And this is actually old, it's like almost 10 years old, right? And so, and I want to bring a few visualizations that that use abstract language and that were very powerful throughout this pandemic. That is a never-ending story. I hope it will end, but let's not dwell on that, please. And so, and I don't know how many of you have seen these in the front page. So I'm actually going to show two visualizations from the New York Times, and actually the attention to technology and to the medium. Because if I'm talking here about communication and actually how we engage our readers and viewers into our visual representations, we should also be very careful about the medium that we choose to do and how we choose to go about that. And so there is a very abstract way in which the New York Times created this, you know, kind of, it feels almost like how we learn to draw in school in terms of creating texture, creating blackness, even with type, right? It's like, and how easy we can see these layers of that. And online, they actually, and I'm bringing here a close up that you can see what they actually stand for. And, you know, there is here, you know, what each dot represents, which is a person, and how horrifying the whole thing is, right? And online, they actually decided not to create any visualization, and they actually only show images, which I find it very, very powerful. It's also making the decision, right? When to use what. So the other front page and online companion is what I still think that there is a visual argument here by the way that they decided not to flat this graph and actually keep this, you know, incredible spike line here in using the entire, not the entire, but almost the whole front page for that one peak there, and how it is much more powerful actually on paper than it is online. And while it is a descriptive image, closer to a descriptive image, right? Because of actually just showing what is going on with the jobs losses, is actually used as an argument, right? Because of the way it is laid out on the page, right? So those are things that I would just like to put there as a conversation in terms of these continuum there, you know, that not necessarily you have to eliminate everything or to make those compromises, but sometimes it's the layout, the way by which we present these images that actually argue visually. And here again is, I think, another example in my view, and again, we can argue whether they actually are used as such, but actually by inviting people to draw a line, right? And it goes back to what you were talking in the beginning, Max, when you're raising issues of ethical or bias and so on and so forth, and how here, by inviting the reader to draw a line, how they actually highlighted people biases given the topics that they set forth. And so I don't know how, are you all familiar with this particular one here? No?
I have not seen the plot, but this is a very strong experiment. So
yeah, let's go there. Let's go there. Yeah, since we have time, we have a little time, right? Yeah. Okay. I still have more talk, but let's go there just for the sake. And so so pretty much they ask the viewers, this was the very first one that they created. They asked the viewers, and then after that they created a series of those. But how you draw it, how family, so they're asking the viewer how family income predicts children college chances. And I've done this so many times, and I've presented this so many times because it's actually from 2015. And so, you know, and they explain it in text. We would like you to draw your guess, right, of how the relationship between the income level and the college chance. And so they give the viewer a hint in terms of that the line should go through here, but they don't say where you're starting or where you should end or how actually you're going to draw a line, right? And so if any of you would like to guide me here, I would be happy to do. Should I start at 10, 20, 30, 100? The percent of, so here we have on the y-axis, the percent of children who attend college, and on the x-axis, we have the parents' income percentile from poorest to richest.
Let's go from 25 to 90 in a straight line.
Okay, so I have to go through here because otherwise it will not let me. Okay, to 90 on a straight line. Sorry, it's not very straight. Let me bring this down because it will complain. Okay, is that okay?
Yeah.
Should I? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll make it more into a straight line here. Kind
Well,
of,
it's
right?
completely straight because there are 3 points. So anyway, it should be somewhere.
Yeah, it's
yeah, well, that's okay.
Okay, so I'll say I'm done, right? And, you know, it gives you back, it returns back to you what you've done, right? Thanks for the drawing. And so we actually did it you did it pretty well, right? So our guess now on this dotted line, and the reality is actually shown there. And they give you, you know, and we can do it again, we can do something completely wrong, and they will tell you, they will give you a different text. Thanks for the drawing, here's what you did. You drew a more accurate picture of reality than 99% of the people who tried so far, right? So you actually, you know, spot on. And you know, your line was very straight, which means you correctly guessed one of the more striking findings of this research: the relationship between college enrollment and parental income rank is linear. And then, you know, they actually give you back a picture of all the other people who have actually engaged with this, which is, you know, in case you're wondering, here's a chart showing the aggregate choice of 78,000 other New York viewers. And I probably did already 100 of those as I shared in class, not that many, but anyway, but it's pretty much, I believe, an argument here, right? And so if I, just to show the point here, if I go here and if we draw it again, and if we do something completely different here, right? And then we say, you know, kind of goes down or whatever, right? Sorry. Just an absurd thing here, right? So whatever. Let's say that it's something like that and I'm done. And so, well, this is awkward. You see, so they give you back some, of course, it's in the algorithm, you know, of what is going on there. And so, and then eventually, you know, pretty bad. So going back to the presentation, sorry, gosh. Yeah, I think that we can make arguments in different ways, right? And even help the viewers understand their own biases or their own thoughts in that way. So let me bring you guys here. And there are other ways in which that can be done as well. And so here's an example of, you know, concretizing. And so I don't know if you've seen this. Have you seen this?
No.
Let's go there. So keep an eye here. So it's pretty much, you know, using, you know, our own time on the web, right, to actually be, you know, appalled by the number of plastic bottles sold, given the data. So while they are, and they're going to come to an end at one point there at 1 million pretty much, but there are different ways that they actually show, and what in the jargon of visualization nowadays we're calling concretizing data, right? So giving concrete comparisons, which have been with us for a very long time, but anyway, that's one of the terms that is being used these days in terms of how many, depending, and the relationship is with time, right? And so in the past 10 years, then we have to move to the geospace and go to New York City and so on and so forth. And so so that's the story there. Just to so it goes back to what we were trying to say earlier, that actually design and the conversation here is really that involves intentions, involve compromise, involve choices. And why can't we make those choices? And as designers, that's what we do all the time, right? And so the same way that writers do that all the time, and we do that all the time with our words, our selection of words as we write, right? And they affect the viewers and interpretation in similar ways. And so I think that's part of what I'm trying to say here. So and then I'm going to go break in conversation with another book. Not, I mean, could be many other things, and we can discuss, but it's actually in this book, and what eventually, in other parts, he actually mentions about that there is nothing neutral. But in here, the only part that I want to say is that in any case, it is unlikely that we shall make much progress in understanding how images work unless we start from the assumption that our senses were given us to apprehend meanings rather than shapes. And I think, again, it's like not that I want to go very deep into that, but I think that that's very important, especially when we're talking about abstract representations. So we are actually imagining that, and that was the point here, that people are not seeing circles and lines, but eventually they are interpreting a tiger in this particular case. And there, of course, if people are not familiar with that this is in London, that eventually there is the symbol of the London Underground, but it doesn't change, right? The fact that what we're depicting here. And we can talk about conventions, and we can talk about, realistic depictions, but how our mind actually looks for meaning. So with that, I would like to travel back to other familiar sort of images. And perhaps the most familiar is the one on the right, on the far right, which is actually when we want to go to places and we put on our, smartphones, and we ask, I want to go from here to there. And so what I did was just, I used the itinerary of Matthew Perry's from London to the Holy Land, but eventually I'm actually traveling in this particular case in this trip over time, exactly the same trajectory, the same route diagram, or the same route visualization from London to Dover, right? So Dover is here, even though Beauvais is here, but I'm actually going here. So in the first example, what we have here is a hand drawn, and it's actually telling us major milestones that we're going to encounter and how they look like. This is pretty much a perspective from the ground, from the person who is encountering these buildings or these as they go, so they can identify and recognize, not only recall, but recognize, which is a much easier cognitive action to take. And so we go and there's, you know, different times and so on, and we arrive in Dover. If we move to the 17th century here with John Ogilvy from London to Dover, and we actually have, you know, several, it's much more detailed, whereas here we had only 2 stops before Dover. We here have several. We have other inventions that actually have been included here, like the compass, like, you know, and I'm going to get into we lose color, you know, eventually there is a beautiful, if we look into the history of the book, and we're going to see that in the very beginning, what happens is that by losing color, because things couldn't in the beginning have color or even images, you know, other spatial decisions had to be made in order to help us navigate the page, and spatial representation was among them, like indentations and so on and so forth, are inventions that come or get more evident with the print, for example. And then we come to this absurd, what I call absurd Google thing, that actually we lose sight. We are completely on God's view, on flying over space, and we no longer have any sense of milestones, because we cannot even read the name of those streets, because those huge, large, you know, blue dots cover they completely obliterate what we are supposed to be reading, which are names of streets or names of roads. And, you know, I think it's, you know, this kind of really disturbingly badly designed decision of covering the route rather than showing the route. So we see everything else but the route, right? We see, you know, depending on your view.
Well, that depends on what you want from that route. If you want to look around, then you care about the number of the names of streets. If what you are interested in is only to know where to turn right and turn left, then you lose information which you do not need.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. It's always related to the task that you have. And but in this particular case, we are trying to navigate into space that is unknown, that we have never been before. And so in order not to get lost, eventually, you know, it's a wayfinding or, you know, way showing kind of problem, right? It's like, how do I know when to turn right? Eventually, when I recognize a building that I am familiar with, or if you think back into how you give directions to your house, right? We normally say, oh, when you hit that, you know, corner store where they have a blue sign, you turn right. You don't even need to give name to streets, right? And so I want just to talk about some of the design decisions made here in terms of the different iconography that we see on these 3 different technologies that actually have exactly the same task, that going from London to Dover. And one is very much realistic in the sense of trying to depict, you know, characteristics of these buildings that the walker, the person walking there, would encounter. And we see how actually those become symbolic in the John Ogilvy, that, you know, churches become a symbol for church, or castles become a symbol for castles, and so on and so forth. We move from the ground, from the perspective of the eyes to the perspective of above. So we see some geographic features such as mountains or forests, and so on and so forth. And we get a sense of the north as well. Here, of course, in my phone, I had to turn the north a different way. I had to turn the north a different way because eventually we're going south, right, from London to Dover. And but eventually we see a satellite view, right, that is being rendered to us in this particular way. You wanted to say something, Max? I see.
I think it's very interesting to bring these examples up. And so one of the things that is sort of silently always swinging with us is this notion of evolution and everything getting better and stuff like that. While all of these things you're describing in any one of the three you would be able to find in any one of the three periods, which is quite funny. And so one thing which I'd like to mention, which I think is interesting for everybody, is that there is different genres of maps, and at the same time, different genres of maps emphasize different things. Like pilgrim maps for Rome, for example, do always de-emphasize the ruins, up to the point that in 1999, they seem to have hired somebody who is not able to interpret a satellite image to make the ruin look more shabby, so people don't sway and go to the ruin, but go to the churches which were very prominently represented on the map. People have done this in the around 1500, they have done it around 1750, and they still do it. And what you bring up, I think, Mike saying, if you only need the decision if you turn left and right, then you don't need all that information. But I think one thing we should be, which you're emphasizing with the example, which I think is very important, is actually it's not that neutral, to bring that word up again. It's actually obfuscation. So basically you focus on the stuff the cell phone company or Google in this particular case wants you to focus on. And so that is, I think, a very important notion where we can indeed see in a lot of areas a kind of Baroquization, counter-reformation of depiction, where sort of like, if there's a choice between selling you something, that is the choice. And it's not sort of the representation, that kind of game that was going on from, say, 1350 to Alexander von Humboldt, to say, let's depict the world more precise, and I tell you more about the world that you actually wanted to know, but isn't it interesting? Which you can totally see in the middle example, which is a very fine and early example for this kind of map, which, not many people are familiar that zenith of that kind of type of map was reached in the mid-18th century. And any map we can buy today is probably of lesser quality if you don't go to things like Google Earth and Google Maps, where you can zoom in infinitely. And it's not, in fact, one map, but many, 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 many maps. And so that, I think, is sort of something really, really important, that the obfuscation and the sort of like bending people to see only a certain a part of what is possible to be depicted is one very important thing, where your talk also stands in connection with many of the talks we had throughout the semester and even the semester before, which is about this kind of like, how is our attention biased, the economy of attention. So that is something really interesting, and that makes us to actors that are actively taking part in this. If we decide to depict something in a certain way, we are sort of guilty or non-guilty by obfuscating.
And in a way, it's like, it's a decision. That's what I'm bringing here. It's the decision, and I'll come to you, Mark. It's the decision of actually what to show and how to show, and from which perspective. What is the perspective, the point of view, not only from bird's eye, from eyesight, right? But also what we show and what we upload or omit, right? Please, Mark.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to share that it brought to mind this kind of pragmatic approach to kind of approaching understanding sort of crafts in like digital humanities, but I think it's also been applied to like understanding maps more specifically. I don't know that too well, but the kind of pragmatic approach that talks about these cognitive leaps, it's kind of the how I interpreted it was that you have if you look at this Google Maps version, so in a sense it's bigger, maybe it's bigger cognitive leap from this real getting from point to B as a person would perceive it, and then how he sees it on the screen. And this maybe on the picture on the left, maybe it's smaller cognitive leap. Hey, it's just one town in there, one town in here, and then I go from here to there. Like it seems really simple to connect these two, maybe, or etc. But of course, as it came out from your talk as well, that this whether this cognitive leap to like understand this way of mapping, it really depends on what the user is accustomed to. That's where the pragmatism comes out, of course. So if we're used to let's say thinking about from this in this Google Maps sort of top-down maps, then I think the cognitive leap is smaller. And actually, if we think about the culture's sort of increase of cultural complexity and sort of variability in it, then I would imagine that there's bigger variability of people who would prefer the maps on the left and the people on the right to prefer Google Maps. And I wouldn't be so sure that everyone would comfortably be able to actually read Google Map in such a way and interact with it, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I agree that we are actually looking at a very pragmatic problem here that is going from point A to point B that you've never been, right? And so that's why there is a huge history, actually, as Max pointed out, of actually route maps and interesting examples is, and of course here is just to point out that there is some decision being made here in terms of why one and not the other, and what to show even in those milestones, right? And not what not to show, and so on and so forth, and the types of design elements that are included or not included here, and to point out that eventually nowadays no one carries a piece of paper in their pockets, but until very recently we did, right? And we would draw, on a napkin, sketches of how people would get to people's house, right? Rather than sending a link to the Google map. And, of course, I understand also that in the Google map, we could actually change the view, go from this satellite view to, putting myself into the view of the image and changing that, but that, I think it's like in the comparison here in terms of actually looking off about the route, right? And without thinking that they could use the voice telling me, now you turn right, and I don't even know where, why I should turn right or what elements I should look for. But I want to continue here in terms of why I think that is actually very important. That we make the decisions that how we're going to, what elements we are creating and designing with the. Thank you, Mark. Do you have another?
I would have a question about kind of the aspect of realism and why you think it's not maybe that relevant, but we can leave that to the end. Actually, maybe it's a bigger question.
Go ahead. Yeah. Why realism is not important?
Oh, okay. So for example, if we talk about the potential informativeness of each of this way of mediating the maps, or this getting from point A to point B, so it's of course like about the interpretation of the person who uses it the pragmatic way, but there's still like you could talk about how well it kind of, or how truthful it depicts the real world. Is there actually a river in that place or not? And this kind of potential informativeness, or like, so I'm kind of like realism versus pragmatic perspective. Why did you, for example, why did you say that? Why did you choose to focus more on whether it is truthful or not? This kind of question.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier.
I think they are, all three versions here serve the same purpose of taking a person walking. When I chose the Google, I chose the one walk. That's why it's a one day, because geology is always the one day, and so it's like basically, and it says very clearly that it would take us a day to walk non-stop, and basically I don't think I'm contrasting here the realism with the abstract representation. I actually, when I pointed to Google Maps, the problem for me with the Google route, the way of depicting the route is that it's just actually occluding the route rather than actually showing the route. So we actually see everything that is on the side, or things that I don't need to know, this level of information. And so, what I need to know is actually where I should be turning, if I should be going, if I'm going up on a hill or going down on a hill or inside a forest or looking for certain buildings that are familiar to me so that I know that I took the right turn, right? Instead of, am I, you know, when you get out of a subway station and you look outside and say, should I turn right or should I turn left, right? You know, that kind of thing here. So I'm not, and I'm going to come to that point that eventually I hope will also bring the same problem later. So it's similar in a way for me, the view of the Google map by showing everything that there is over there. And there is a reason why that technology does that, right? Is for me very similar to what I was talking when I mentioned Borges and Funes, of actually seeing every leaf in every tree around me, rather than actually helping me focus on what I should be focusing on. So that's more or less my argument here, if it makes sense at all.
I'd like to add a point which is sort of connects to, you know, visualizing what we have seen before. Like if you do a network diagram, you have two different link types, say, right? And one you do with a regular line and one you do with a dotted line, for example. Like what's typically happening is that we're working with some kind of tool, and this may be, you know, Cytoscape or GFI or, you know, regular SVG, whatever. So you do dotted line in Illustrator. And so you pick Japanese dots and the dots are picked, you know, they're put somewhere so it looks harmonic. That's exactly what's going on in this particular case in Google Maps. The dot size doesn't tell you anything about the distance, while in the middle example, there is also dots on the street, which are actually within the street, so you can actually see what's on the side of the street, while at the same time, the dots are actually, you can count them. So if you're at a particular location, you walk past a certain tree and you want to know what the distance to the next pub is, you can actually just look that up and just count these dots and then know what's going on. And so why don't we do stuff like this in network diagrams? Obviously, okay, in network diagrams, distance doesn't play a role most of the time, but in many plots, distance plays a role, and people in line dots nevertheless draw Japanese dots, right, like they come out of the tool, which is an artistic sort of definition of like having dots harmonically spread out. But if you draw a dotted line, it's much, much, much harder with the tools we have so far to actually draw them in a way that you could actually say, just count. And our retina is really good at counting. You don't really need to do 1, 2, 3, but just by seeing,
because we're seeing it's the same way that the New York Times shows those dotted lines, right? So we see density when there is more dots close together, because it's a density issue, right? It's about texture, right? Yeah. And so so it's really about intention. The conversation here is, I'm not saying there is a right and wrong here, even though I made a critique. I shouldn't have been so forceful about my critique about Google, because it really bothers me. But but basically, it's really about the design intention. What is it that is important to reveal, right? And how we're going about revealing that, and what happens if we choose a way that is perhaps not as efficient or not as expressive, right? Of what we are what we want to convey, right? So that is pretty much the thing here. And we are going to come back, because I'm going to show another example that is kind of weird, and that I hope will also kind of show that point, Mark. And I'll come back to you to see if we're still in the same trip to Dover. Okay. So of course we are dealing with, you know, maps and projections, and you know, I don't want to dwell on these things that we all know, the problems of the Mercator projection, and how, you know, Google, there is it's kind of a slightly modified version, and we understand the reasons why they need that, because of, you know, they need it the correct way to actually for the person on the ground, right? So that there is a right turn is a right turn, but I don't want to enter into that. But I want the point here by showing the Mercator is that we should not rely on Google Maps for our visualizations either, right? And so because they distort areas and in ways that are problematic, right? In terms of, or ethically problematic if you move away to the poles, right? And so pretty much what, and I think you're all familiar with this. If you're not, I'm not going to open right now, but it's actually the true size of that actually shows the distortions that we, or maybe we go there just for my point here. And there are games, there are things like that, that actually shows the problems of distortions. I'm not going to, you can enjoy it later, but eventually we can see how, you know, the US, you know, if we keep moving, you know, into the Mercator, what happens with the distortions, right? And so and so on and so forth, and how different countries would move, and you know, and I'm not going to enter into that, but the point is there is a distortion, and when we are mapping, even if we are using a globe, right, and by tracing lines that actually fly over, right, we should be thinking about these issues. And so it is actually staggering that we would have one of the most viewed visualizations throughout this pandemic, right, that actually uses Google Map to plot data, right, that actually, you know, and this is most recent, I took it last night, and we are, you know, seeing Greenland larger than Africa for the distortions that I just showed, right? And of course, there is a horrifying number there that reminds us of the horrors of the pandemic that we are living. And actually, a view, I kept taking photos of these throughout the pandemic. And here, you know, they changed their algorithm because now there is way more deaths, right? So now the size of the dots has to be changed, the proportions there, because eventually we are facing way more deaths. And so it is very important that we understand the consequence of our choices, not only of the elements that we put there, whether they are, you know, realistic or symbolic or abstract, that we understand the structures where we are actually presenting these as well. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to comment that the much more important issue, which is, well, basically a choice which distorts the information, is to keep to the official death figures, which are reported with ridiculously different quality in different countries, and in some countries is clearly manipulated.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there are so many problems there. Eventually, I agree. I was just trying to make a point here about the projection map and the, you know, staying with the. But I agree that, you know, what we decide.
Basically, my short point is that looking at these numbers essentially gives you quite a distorted. For example, we do understand that the number of deaths in India is underreported by a factor of more than 10, probably. Yeah. So it gives you a very distorted understanding, because it looks like everything is happening in Europe, but Europe is actually just good at reporting what's happening compared to other places.
Well, I think there are several issues, important issues that you bring here, right? In terms of the reliability of the data. What is the data that we're actually looking here? And we know all the problems about, you know, the problems and the challenges with this pandemic is that eventually there are many people who, it's not only governments, you know, keeping track of deaths, because there are many stories about how actually individuals in journalism had to collect data for the US, right? So it's not only India or Brazil or other countries that are in the global south, but basically the difficulties posed by the pandemic and the access to hospitals and other people who are dying that are not being counted. And, you know, there's a whole discussion about ethics and about who who is counted and why they're being counted and when they're being counted. But I will skip that for today, given the pressure of time. But it's all to say there are a number of projections that actually we can choose from and that we should stop and think about. So it's also part of our responsibilities as we communicate visually data, whether descriptive or argumentative, that we make informed choices. It's all about choices, right? And so I want to present here an early example of what could have been done today, which is this 1942 spread of the Fortune magazine on this map done by Richard Harrison, that actually the choice of the projection, right? So he's actually here, you know, showing where the people working for Time, Life, and Fortune traveled around the world to present, to carry over issues that were reproduced at those three magazines, and the choice of a polar projection here, and how he actually, you know, which is much easier to see because we're seeing from the top, so that we actually see where these people have navigated. And of course, they were circulating much more in the northern hemisphere than they were in the southern hemisphere, which also facilitates the view from the north. But in any case, it is a network visualization. It's on a map, so that we are given a specific structure that is given by the map, but the choice of the projection actually tells a story that I think with very particular intentions in terms of the projections being shown. So I will show different maps by the same designer at Fortune magazine, and the choice that are all connected to networks. They are all, of course, anchored in physical space, that is the geolocation, but how the choices of those maps were intentional and actually were also explained to the readers who are not familiar with these particular types of projections. Sorry, there was a third one. It's kind of slow.
And it's interesting that this is like one example where a convention is really, you know, always almost, you know, like an avalanche coming down from the mountain. So it's so hard to avoid, because even to say, you know, here's a new map projection, it's much better. You have, in order to make an argument for it, you have to mention the alternative, which is Mercator projection. Right? And then so that again sort of like makes advertising for that other projection. And then there is a lot of things where would be interesting to see or hear your opinion about this, where these kind of maps are, you know, they are so unique. In this particular case, you can name the designer by just saying, by showing the example, say, I show you a map of the same designer. Similarly, even worse, maybe, you know, Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion map, which is actually a quite cool one, can still not be sort of freely used because the estate sort of holds the copyright, which is so unbelievable. Thinking about the fact that, like, he was actually, you know, given the intention he was talking about of bringing us all together. And so that is sort of something which, how do you see that fold out, that there are certain things that cannot really easily be used because there's all these hindrances of like needing to explain again and sort of like not being able to use it. Like this thing here is a miracle, right? It's Mike Bostock's attempt to enumerate all the different geographic projections and make it available for free, including the tool with which he did it, which is also free, which is D3. That is a really, really cool thing, right? Isn't it?
Yeah. So what my point here is, there is a facility with which we can use the Google Map, right, projection to render things, because it's there, because it's, you know, there are tools that use that projection, and that's why we see it very often. It actually carries problems of colonization, given how it was created. It carries problems of actually, you know, area distortions, as I pointed out, that are problematic. And so what I'm inviting here is say, hey, we've been doing, and I actually had, a set of maps, and, there are early examples, and I'm just, in Minar, and I actually shared, several examples of Minar in my book that actually are, he even uses, and I excluded, the slide is still there in my excluded slides there, but actually that show distortion, right? That actually, we know that he knew how to do maps, and yet he decided to distort the shapes of the word to actually emphasize the amount of cotton, in this particular case, being shipped around the word. So it's all about what my talk here is about, the intentions and the choices that we make, right? And how much it is important to make these choices, right? Mm-hmm. And so if we believe that our viewers are going to have problem with the choices that are better choices, just, so I'm saying we should not be perpetuating bad choices such as the Mercator, because people know how to read them, right? Because they had these, the geography books that they studied with, right? And, we should, and people have done this frequently in the past and still do it nowadays, choosing better choices or projections for a specific purpose. That's why there are so many choices here in front of us. So that is the point here, right? Mike, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that Mercator map is a unique choice, which is unique in its simplicity, of its creation. Therefore, I see, and it exists mathematically as a particular unique choice of
every single projection. Sorry to interrupt. Every single projection is a mathematical solution.
There is only one way to put a cylinder around a sphere. There is nothing colonial about this.
Okay, I am going to skip that conversation, and let's come to the end of that, and we go back. There is not only one way to do it. I'm sorry. I'm not going to discuss, projection. And there are 3 different ways that eventually have been devised and that actually have created all these. I don't have I have to open my...
There are different ways to make a projection. There is only one way to put a cylinder around the circle, around the sphere.
But so can we, yeah, if you decide
different ways that you can
if you decide where the poles are and where the equations.
Yes, well, if you decide where the poles are,
that is exactly the point, though.
But the poles are where there are the poles. I'm sorry, you cannot, there is nothing colonial about the fact that Northern Pole is the Northern Pole and not in the middle of, I don't know, in Tal.
So this is a coincidence. If Greenwich would be in the center of Africa, people wouldn't have chosen that kind of projection, I'm pretty sure.
So you're saying...
I'm sorry, but the part of the world which is most enlarged is Antarctica, which is nobody is living there.
So you're saying
that the fact that Africa is small on this map is irrelevant.
I'm showing a projection that is not Mercator. Correct?
Go ahead. Sorry. Let's postpone the discussion.
So this is not a Mercator projection that you're looking at and you didn't realize, right? Because this is the Mercator projection, correct? And this is not a Mercator projection. And so what I'm pointing here is that there are different projections, and I can point to books about maps, several books about maps, including a chapter of my book that actually describes that all maps distort, all of them, because of being a mathematical problem, right? And so it's the choices and the compromises that we make of what projection we are choosing, whether we are distorting the shape, the area, or the angle, or all of them. It's a choices that we make, and that we should be making. That is the point here.
That is true. That is absolutely true.
And so, so basically here there is a choice that carries a ton of distortions, right? If we think about shapes are completely distorted. They are no longer the shapes that we are familiar with for some areas, for example, right? And yet it is, I believe, a very informed decision to choose a north pole polar projection to show the trips of all these journalists over a year because of where they went around, right? And so that is the point here. It's about choosing what to choose and not hitting the default button of a Mercator projection.
I think the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? The key thing is that most people don't even hit the button of the Mercator projection. They just take the degrees of plus minus 180 and plus minus 90. And if you draw that sort of like as a rectangle, that's just the simplest way how people deal with numbers. Because
I think the problem is different.
Right?
The problem is different. I think the problem is different, Max, because I think people are choosing, they're not choosing the Mercator projection. They're not even thinking that they are making a choice. That is the problem. The problem is that people are not aware that by using the Mercator, they have made a choice because they are not aware of all the other projections, right? And how, you know, we have, you know, newspapers having changed, you know, and choosing other projections, you know, because of some of the problems that I raised. And I don't want to dwell on that because I saw that there was a, you know, because my point here is actually, I want to invite people to make choices and to make, more importantly, make informed choices.
Yeah.
May I ask one more question? Actually, just to be sure it is not intended as a criticism towards what you are saying. I'm just a little bit surprised because, well, in my personal experience of, well, Soviet school system, I do remember being grilled at this point extensively at, I think, 5th or 6th grade of school when studying geography, with discussing all these different sorts of projections. Is it not a part of curriculum in other countries?
Yeah, I'm originally from Brazil. That's where I am from. That's the accent that you hear. So I'm from here, from actually around where my finger is here is like really on the southeast of Brazil. We do discuss, we do have a conversation about that. However, there are other, from my reading, for example, right? There are, I think in the US, and I'm not familiar, maybe Max is more familiar with the school system there, I don't know. But eventually, I don't know if, you know, your daughter was old enough to have studied, you know, having to go through this at school, so I don't know. But basically, that's why I'm pointing to you, Max. But basically, what I can say is, I don't know the answer to that. But I think as we are engaging with visual representations and with maps and with plotting data on maps, we should be talking about these issues. That's my only point here. Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, you have to assume, in the US context at least, if you do a visualization course, even at the grad level, you cannot assume that people are aware. I mean, they're aware of there's different map projection maybe, but they are definitely not capable of enumerating them. That is, I think, a very important point. And so I don't want to make this a value judgment about one school system against the others, but I think that what we're undergoing right now is indeed a learning process in the wider society regarding map projections, regarding scatter plots, regarding exponential growth, regarding visualizations, where the audience either has to be taught or be reminded of these kind of things, because it's not only having it learned in school or not, but there is these kind of things like how much did they learn or whatever, right? and how much do they remember it. But I think
yeah, sorry.
Important point is also, like, if you have all these things as at your sort of choice, like if this is the restaurant menu, you have some data, you want to plot it geographically. And you have to plot it. Like, you know, the US, if it's continental US data, you pick the top left one, of course, because it's simple, because Tableau has it as a kind of default or whatever. But then the other thing is, as you say, all of the others are a projection. Like the first one is 2, of course, but there is only one projection where you don't have to actually calculate, which is just take the raw degrees, which ends up being the Mercator projection, which is why a lot of people actually just, you know, many maps, I would surmise, are actually just scatter plots of lat long. And then sort of like, you know, you put them on a map or whatever. And I think that is sort of something that is really important, that all of a sudden what we are demanding here is not just saying, oh, there needs to be an awareness. What we're demanding is that people actually think in nonlinear transformations about a geometry. And that is a hard issue. And that's the reason why I would say every 10th person clicks on it and every 100th person actually starts drawing a more complicated map, even though it would be more fair to do the more complicated map. I think there's a very big problem there.
There is a problem of the tools that we have at our disposal that actually have some maps embedded in them, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm saying here. There is a default there, mm-hmm. right? And the default is the Mercator for the fact that actually the right angles there for that's what made it powerful for navigating in the mm-hmm. ocean, right? And hence the colonial aspect that I mentioned, right? It was actually to go to discover other worlds, Mike. So that was the point there. And so that was the reason why it was created, when it was created, for the purpose it was created, and why it perpetuated, right? And actually the right angle in which it is actually projected onto, right, facilitates the calculations. And that's why Google, when they created the Google map, did it. Just to finish a thought here, I just want to and I come to you, but basically what the point here, right? And I actually have this in my book here, saying that very famous Robinson, who actually writes extensively about maps and actually has the projection as well, says there is no such a thing as a bad projection. There are only good and poor choices. And that's my point here, right? So if we just should make choices, not let the tools make the choice for us. That's my point.
Mm-hmm. We have 6 more minutes.
I'll come there. So for example, here, very simple example, rather than choosing to start at midnight, right? That would be the default. We start from 0 to 0 in this very simple visualization that is no longer available because it was flash. You know, there is a shift because what we are trying to see is when people work, right? So those are informed decision choices that are important to have as we do things, not taking things by default that the hour goes from 0 to 0. That the default map is the Mercator that exists out there. And with all due respect, and you know, I want to show, for example, a very simple change in this image that was published in this book, in this paper about the Human Disease Network by Barbashi Lab a long time ago. And when actually it was published at the New York Times, and again, it's like a flash interface that no longer exists. The simple change of actually changing the typeface, for example, here, how it facilitates the reading of this complex image. And that's the only change that we see pretty much here. Of course, there are some colors, right? And but it's basically very simple informed design choices that can and should be made as we create those visualizations. So with that, I would like to say that we actually, need to have those informed decisions, and we need to design for both information and argumentation. So what tools we use to explore our data is one thing. I'm here really making us stop and think and pause for the purpose of communication. And I'm going to skip that video, which is a pity. It's a 3-minute video, but we have to finish in 10 minutes. And but basically, to show a very simple example related to procedural, what I call procedural information is how we go about, or how things function, or how we perform things. We've seen a number of those throughout the pandemic, how we wash our hands, how viruses spread if we don't have airs, and so on and so forth, to bring us to sort of a conversation that started there, that Mark was also asking about realistic against kind of more symbolic or abstract, if I understood it correctly. I have a collection of these safety instructions that I've been collecting for over 10 or 15 years, since I actually read an article, and I used to give it to my students about from Gombrich. Actually, that's why I went back to Gombrich, and I actually flew on most of those, but eventually I also started receiving from friends who helped me with my collection, and I very kind of randomly picked some of them. So if we look at these, right, so those are all, they're all the same, right? Every single plane, or sometimes trains that we enter, they have those safety instructions there. Those are requirements, right? And those are actually, as Gombrich puts in the pictorial information, the article there, I don't remember the name, is actually those are lifesavers, right? Our lives depends on those if we know how to perform certain actions in the case that we need. I'm picking a very simple action to compare here, that is simply the bucket, the seat belt, right? And how this simple thing that is can also save lives in cars and in planes and wherever, is actually depicted, and what the design decisions that were made here. So here we have photographs, right, that could not be more realistic, to go back to what I don't know if that was what Mark was saying, but eventually we have a photograph. And what the problem with these, in my view, is that eventually now we're looking the world, and that's the problem of funis, of seeing every single leaf in every single tree, because we are attending to details of the hand and the rings and the horrible fabrics used on seats in airplanes and the colors and so on and so forth, right? And having to put those gigantic arrows that actually would never work, because they sit on both, light backgrounds and dark backgrounds, and they have to be used. And that's why they have this huge white border around them, so that they would work in any situation. To going to, okay, so if we're not using the photograph because the world is so complex that we lose sight of what is important here, what about we create models of these, right? And so should we, we start removing information, because we no longer have a body when we can only show certain things. We need to show all these steps. Do we really need to see a figure, or can we use a model that actually doesn't tell us whether this is male or female, whether this has a skin color or not, whether they are dressed properly or not? And so we also, I would like to point that there is a perspective view. So I'm looking at someone from the front of it. So I'm looking at someone that is not me. I'm having to perform an action, but it's not me. I'm actually looking at someone else, at a mirror image. There is a point of view that is being decided here, the types of arrows, the types of lines, the same way that we looked at before. Now, this is the and I really just took, because I have so many that I didn't have time to keep making really important selections, but this is the only one in this quick selection that I grabbed it from the box that is actually shows from my perspective. If I am sitting on the plane and I'm tying my belt, this is my view. That's the only time when I see my hands from my eyes, not from the person in front of me. And that's an important decision, right? Of course, there are other important decisions here in terms of actually the situations that we've seen before. But in the sake of time, I'm just finalizing here. So I think that is an important, that's part, you know, of decisions that are being made, right? And we could carry, but I think the point here goes to a question that Max put to me in the very beginning, is like, how do we go about education, right? And how do we go about helping people make informed decisions and understanding that their choices carry meaning, right? And so even the choice of actually not paying attention to the default map projection that is in their software. And so, and really, I think it is important to have that conversation as we carry on making those visualizations. And so to finalize, I want to bring this very old article by Herbert Simon and Jill Larkin, that actually is why a diagram is sometimes, not always, right, worth and pretty much what they do, and I'm going to go very fast, they make different they sample engineering students in different ways, and this is the first one that they mentioned, that they give this problem, it's a physics problem, and how the students would solve it if it's only textual or with the aid of a diagram. And to make a and you can go there if you want, but to actually move on, they actually conclude, and that was not the only one, that eventually diagrams can help, you know, when we don't need to make that argument here, right? And some cognitive processes. But the point here that I wanted to make is actually, and there are different why the reasons, and I'm not going to go there, but the point here is that the sometimes there is not because we have a diagram or a visualization that we are actually setting forth the information, right, or actually making an argument. Is actually they need to have to support those cognitive processes that we're asking them, whether it is the recognition of a castle as I walk by it, or whether it's the recalling an information that I have to recall as I solve a problem, or actually I'm able to navigate in the space of visualization to understand what the argument is being set forth. But I also need to know, right, what how to make them. But this means that diagrams are useful only to those who know the appropriate computational process to take. Furthermore, a problem solver often also needs the knowledge of how to construct a good diagram that lets him take advantage of the virtues we have discussed in the article. And I hope I have discussed here. So it actually, thank you, Max, for the question. So I don't have the answer, but I think that's the question that I wanted to leave you with, right? And so
thank you very much. So we unfortunately ran out of time.
And my last point here is that with this image is that there is no right or wrong answer, right? There is a spectrum, right? And it really depends on what we are trying to do here. So what I love about this picture of Martin Kerr is basically every single person that is being photographed by this person is actually holding the Pisa Tower, right? And from their angle, from their perspective, they are correct. From our perspective here, right, it is fun, right? And that's the point of it. And so that's what I want to leave you with. Sorry. That's the problem of a conversation. We take it longer. I should have cut some people, but yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Isabel. This was great. And so I'd like to emphasize that this is, I think, a very, very important contribution, because doing visualization is very much not only something that is mechanized, but we need to learn for ourselves, but we also need to teach the audience. Like if we want to make an argument visually, we need to also carry this along. Like anybody who has ever been in a village where people don't read maps with a map and thought, if you find your way out, that you have to then rely on like asking people where's the next town with a church and stuff like that. So that is sort of something which I think is super important. And you have shown a number of things that actually where this becomes virulent. And this is something which remains, I think, within cultural data analytics, a major issue as we go along. Maybe in 200 years, we will have settled what are the types of visualization that everybody understands and the broad audience has learned how to do them and how to read them. But so as we go on, we basically have to actually do that work of both learning ourselves what we can do to understand better, teaching other people how to read it, and come up with conventions and breaking conventions which we take for granted. Thank you very much for this awesome talk.
Thank you, Max. I think the part of the education is not the convention, is actually, that's the part of the argumentative visualization, right? Is actually, we need to actually educate not only through convention, but actually we need to understand what we're trying to convey. But anyway.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.